Chapter 1. Completed. Chapter 1. The first year of the war was propitious for the Alliance. It seemed like a sure victory, but after the siege of the Red Mines the course of the war changed radically. Chronicles of the Dragon Ridge, Volume 4. Author, Elia Alaninum. A year later. Agnoruk was running hurriedly through the galleries of the mine, Gosberg accompanying him with a serious countenance. The Fourth Iron War was not proceeding in a manner favorable to the interests of the Kingdom of Demember and the mercenaries. When they arrived in Demember last year, the mercenaries found themselves in a critical situation. The dwarfs of the ridge had already taken over the Fortunate Mines, while the south of the kingdom was being harassed by Olbiana. The situation was also dire in the west. The kingdom of Scythia was trying to block the water channel through which King Dasmir II supplied his capital. The mercenaries had to use all their troops and resources to prevent this, but they failed. In addition, that decision cost them to sacrifice the Kaid mines. That fell with hardly any opposition into the hands of the dwarfs. Luckily they were cautious and did not abandon their positions inside the mines. It was a place too coveted by them. After this setback, they stuck to the initial strategy, except that Debok had to change his initial position in Minas Dakara to occupy the square of Casmin with his troops. This time it was clear that Olbiana and the dwarfs on the ridge had conscientiously prepared the invasion. The alliance between Olbiana, the dwarfs, and Scythia was called the Alliance of the White Leaf, since it was said that the alliance was formalized in a meeting in the forests north of Scythia, where trees called trabezos grow, which stand out for their characteristic white leaves. The alliance demonstrated its power at the Battle of Trasby, which resulted in a resounding defeat for Demember. And only thanks to an orderly retreat did they manage to minimize losses. Later in the Battle of Ulrika the advance of the alliance in the south was stopped, leaving the front stabilized. But the pressure in the west, south, and north by the coalition between the dwarfs and Olbiana was very intense. The invaders besieged the Black Castle in the south under the command of Aris. They did the same in the west with the royal palace in Dasmir where Lorantha's battalion was located. The troops of Silkari and Kush in the southeast were barely holding back the advance of Olbiana. Debok was held in Casmin without knowing where to advance, since leaving the city without troops was an invitation to its occupation. They could not risk losing Casmin Square, as it meant leaving the north isolated, and that would be the beginning of the end. Agnoruk was in the northwest and the situation was not good either. They were stationed there to protect the last mine free of the dwarfs, the Red Mines. They were also the most coveted by them. To their surprise they had to contain an attack by the Alliance at a ford near the north of the mines. They intended to isolate them by cutting off the northern passes. The battle ended in a narrow defeat for Demember. Agnoruk had to retreat to the Red Mines when he saw that he could not hold his position against the enemy and could only try to resist inside their walls. War was hell. They were always fighting against a vastly superior enemy. King Dasmir II appealed to his allies in the Dragon Dorsal League for support. He received a small army at the beginning of the war, but it was certainly very little help for the promises that had been made to him. The other kingdoms asked him for patience, since it was not easy for them to prepare an army in such a short time. King Dasmir reluctantly accepted. Agnoruk's orders were simple: to hold out until the arrival of the League's reinforcements, so said the last letter received by Debok. The letter had arrived a month earlier. Since then he had no news about how the war was going in the south except for rumors that arrived without contrast. The Red Mines were under siege, and although the provisions were sufficient for the moment, the half-orc was not sure he could hold out for long. In recent days the attacks have intensified by the besiegers, but as always the situation can get worse. By dawn the fortifications of the Red Mines were under attack, predictably. Just as he was preparing to go to battle on the walls, Agnoruk received the news that the mines were also being attacked underground. Something that was to be expected from the dwarfs, since that was how they took the Fortunate Mines and Kaid. Knowing this, Agnoruk had been farsighted and stationed 100 of his mercenaries inside the mine. He was the most vulnerable part of the entire square, so he decided to supervise the defense of the galleries himself. He left Kritis, Sabu, and the governor of the Red Mines, Sebastian Darbical, in command of the resistance on the surface. Agnoruk descended with Gosberg to the deepest levels of the Red Mines to stop the attack. It was crucial to resist in the galleries. If they gave in, they would be lost to being attacked on two fronts. They reached the fifth level and what they found was not good news. There were about 40 mercenaries there, many of them wounded who were retreating to the upper levels. Agnoruk advanced decisively until he met Diana, the warrior who commanded the century of mercenaries. What has happened? They appeared on the 7th level an hour ago out of nowhere. I think they dug a tunnel to get into the gallery. It was a good idea to have a detachment in the galleries of the mine, Agnoruk. Gosberg commented. It was necessary, so they took the fortunate mines at the beginning of the war. Replied the half-orc looking at the wounded, it seemed that there were no more survivors. Also, just when we are attacked on the surface. Diana sighed before continuing with her story. She was fatigued. We tried to resist, but it was impossible. They are very well-trained troops. They advanced through the gallery in phalanx formation without anything being able to confront them. So we did what you had planned. On the 6th level we caused a controlled collapse of the gallery. And? Agnoruk asked expectantly. The collapse was not complete. The dwarfs are removing the stones quickly. Soon they will advance again to the higher levels. Gosberg lit a cigarette, while Agnoruk shook his head. We didn't plan it quite right. Lamented the half-orc. The walls of this mine are very stable. Gosberg tapped a pillar in the gallery a few times. What do we do, Agnoruk? Diana was taking her sword to accompany the half-orc. You will go up to the 1st level, stay at the entrance with 6 of your own. Those who are not badly wounded should come to Kritis. We have to defend the outer wall. Diana opened her eyes. She did not expect that order. She wanted to take revenge for the defeat she had suffered, but she continued to listen to the half-orc's orders. If we haven't returned before the sun descends on the eastern peaks, you should throw away the main pillars at the entrance. But sir, that would destroy the whole mine, exclaimed the mercenary perplexed. That's right. But the dwarfs will not take us by two fronts and we will be able to hold out until reinforcements arrive. Diana was paralyzed. Agnoruk and Gosberg were going to certain death, and even if they sacrificed themselves, without the two of them, resistance in the mines would be impossible. It's an order, comply with it. Agnoruk shouted to provoke the mercenaries' reaction. It's 2 against a legion of dwarfs. Diana wasn't going to let them die alone. Diana, it's an order, go up to the top level and if we haven't left before sunset, comply with the captain's order. Gosberg was much more serene than Agnoruk, who was already descending into the 6th gallery. The mercenary could not get over her amazement. Of course both the half-orc and the Denka were great warriors, but the idea of fighting the two of them alone against an army of dwarfs was suicide. In addition, the first order they received upon arrival at the Red Mines from Debok was as their main priority to try to keep the mine safe and operational, as it is the main source of Demember's fortune. That dependence was much greater now that they lost control of the other 2 main mines. In the end Diana gave up. She was actually paid to obey orders without question. He reluctantly helped the wounded up to the upper level, as he watched as Agnoruk and Gosberg advanced towards the 6th level, disappearing from his sight. Destroying this mine is something that Demember cannot afford. Gosberg commented as they began to hear the footsteps of heavy boots. If we fall, it doesn't matter if the mine is destroyed or not, it will be enjoyed by the dwarfs in that case, not Demember. Gosberg smiled. You know very well that wars are based on gold or gems to sustain themselves. It doesn't matter if you don't have the former. The Denka threw the cigarette on the floor. Both stopped at a place that seemed propitious to face the dwarf phalanx that was approaching them. It is more important that debts to be overcome in a war can be paid. Agnoruk commented ironically. You begin to understand what this is about. The Denka smiled as he pulled out a dagger and his eyes began to glow with a characteristic blue light. Too much light. It does not benefit us. Gosberg rarely used his powers in a blatant way, but this time he did, with a twinkle in his eye. The gallery was completely dark. The dwarfs of the Dragon's Ridge quickly carried out the order of their general, the great Darik Whitestone. At first the collapse seemed to stop them, but, although these dwarfs are mainly warriors, they are still dwarfs and maintain the ability to handle stones since they carry it in their blood. They had to lay down their weapons and organize themselves, but after an hour they managed to break through by making an improvised gallery stable enough to continue their march and reach the entrance of the 6th level. She was not General Dariko's favorite, but she was one of his trusted officers. For Tanya Blackgem it was the moment she had been waiting for since the beginning of the war. Since I was a child I had heard the rumors about the massacre in the Blood Mines, that's what the dwarfs call the Red Mines. It was this unexpected defeat that led to the failure of the First Iron War. Since then, what had happened in that mine was surrounded by a halo of terror and mystery. The few survivors spoke of vague references to a blue demon, of something utterly terrifying that slaughtered all the dwarf warriors. No one believed the survivors, they took them for crazy. They all thought that they were either fantastic justifications for the defeat or suffered hallucinations born of the terror of seeing all their comrades in arms dead. The real explanation was much simpler and less fantastic. The dwarf legions were drowned because the king of Demember flooded the galleries thanks to the water that came from an underground river whose course runs very close to the galleries. Even so, Tanya was left in doubt, since the survivors were inside the mines and the rest were not. Such a defeat was not going to happen again. The dwarfs of the ridge in silence, with patience and away from the red mines had managed to divert the course of the underground river. That is why they would win this time. They had prepared for a long time conscientiously so as not to be defeated again. The general ordered the march to be resumed, whereupon the phalanx began to form. Within the confined spaces of the underground galleries the phalanx formation of the Legion of the Brothers of Danka Atar was unrivaled. It was the elite troop of the dwarfs of the Dragon Ridge, the pride of King Broke Blackgem. They had already easily won in Kara Mines and the Fortunate Mines. Once they passed the area of the collapse caused by the defenders, they were able to complete their formation of 5 lines. First the dwarfs with the large shields covered with sharp spikes, then the spearmen, then dwarfs with crossbows, the 4th reinforcement, with shields and swords ready to take the place of the fallen comrades, a group of 10 dwarfs per row. As you can understand, the line that was formed was enormous since the human mines were not as wide as the dwarf ones, but they had an advantage. In narrow spaces the phalanx was unbeatable, although its advance was slow. It took Tanya more than an hour to advance with her battalion. Silence was natural just before entering combat. They did not expect greater resistance than the one they encountered on the 7th level. The plan was clear, to take the mine and attack the defenders of the blood mines from the rear. When he reached the front he began to hear the screams, the wailings, the smell of blood began to flood the gallery. In a wider area of the mine that formed a kind of circular square was General Dariko on 2 or 3 shields reorganizing his dwarfs. He shouted very nervously. It was not usual for the general, something was not right. The fallen were hundreds. The dwarf did not have time to react. He could only hear a sentence full of terror. The blue demon is coming. Tanya was an experienced warrior but she was not prepared for that. Her first line was annihilated in a second, the ranks were broken, some soldiers seeing the massacre tried to flee and collided with those who advanced, generating more chaos. The corpses were piled up on the ground. Tanya tried to keep her composure, but in that darkness it was impossible to see anything, and even though the gloom was her natural habitat and she had her eyes used to it. Then there appeared from the background, those blue eyes illuminating everything in their path, a light of death. Next to the blue demon was another enemy that killed those that the demon seemed not to finish. Tanya stood firm and managed with some soldiers from her battalion to hold the position, and then advanced towards the enemy. They did not take long to make the first onslaught with their shields. A total failure. The only thing she remembered from that fight is that she was thrown towards a wall as if it were a stone. The blow was brutal. She dislocated her shoulder and was wounded in the leg. She was out of combat, sitting on top of the corpses of comrades with her back against the wall, but from that position she could see the massacre. The legends were true. The blue demon had returned to defeat the dwarfs again. Despite the efforts of General Derico, all the lines of the phalanx were massacred. There came a time when the rest of the dwarf troops could not advance as the corpses of their comrades formed an impassable wall and fell on them. Until a blue explosion sent the corpses flying into the air, the dismembered remains struck the dwarf's helm. Tanya had to close her eyes. The screams, the smell of burning flesh flooded the gallery. Tanya spat out pieces of dwarf flesh. He barely opened his eyes, then he could see the blue demon clearly. It was a small Denka that moved at such speed. He had never seen anything like it. He was fast. He threw daggers that always hit the target. If a dwarf came close to his side, his companion finished him with an impressive ability of a single movement. If she did not know her troops well, it would seem that they were simple blades of grass mowed by a gardener. The battle did not last much longer. Surely the rest of the troops had fled in terror when they heard the explosion. Only General Derico and the soldier carrying the Legion's banner remained, a large black spider. Tanya had realized that the demon had left them for last, like the cat playing with the mouse. Derico was breathing tiredly. The situation was overcome. He had never believed the story of the blue demon and now it was in front of him. The demon's companion attacked the standard bearer. The poor soldier tried to defend himself with the sword, but first he was left without a hand and then without his head. And the standard ended up in the hands of his assassin. Only one dwarf was left standing. The general backed away awkwardly, while the Denka looked at him carefully. General Derico, after King Broke, you are the most powerful dwarf on the Dragon Ridge. Who are you, a demon? The Denka smiled, wiped his face of dwarven blood, and lit a cigarette. I don't have the patience for these things anymore. It was fulminant. If Tanya hadn't seen it she would swear it never happened. The Denka had a knife at his waist. He drew it at a high speed and slit the throat of the general, who collapsed on the ground immediately. Then he kicked the corpse. He took the Legion's banner from Agnoruk, its most precious symbol, sacred to Danka Ata's brothers, and stabbed it up the dwarf general's ass, piercing the spider. Gosberg then broke the standard stick in half, driving the remaining piece into the general's back. I have had the same mercy as you have with them. I think we've finished them all, but this time you've exposed yourself too much. Gosberg smiled. Not all of them have died. Many have fled to the 7th gallery. But don't worry, I've got it all under control. Did you kill her? I don't think so. Tanya watched as the couple began to search through the corpses. She knew that they were looking for her, but the dwarf in her state could not move. Gosberg began to walk to where she was lying and smiled at the sight of her. Here's Agnoruk. Solo la has salvado a ella. They both bent down. Tanya was so terrified that she peed on herself. Her heart was about to explode. Gosberg's eyes shone their bluish color even more brightly than before. Light flooded the gallery. The Denka removed the young dwarf's helmet. Tanya Blackgem, the firstborn of King Broke Blackgem. She was destined to be the future queen if it weren't for her suffering from the mark of Abzorum, being disowned by her father. And her only escape was to join the Legion of Danka Ata's brothers, where he rose through his merits to become the right-hand man of the great General Derico. The dwarf did not understand anything, as the Denka knew who she was, as he felt Gosberg's hand caress the part of her face that was deformed. The reason for her father's repudiation of her only solution was military life away from her family at court, although she always proudly bore the royal surname of the House of Black Gem. Agnoruk stared at the dwarf. The truth is that the deformity of the right side was aberrant, but it was not fair how his family had treated him. What are we going to do with you, Tanya? Gosberg asked. Kill me once and for all, with the others you didn't make these games. Gosberg smiled. You're not like everyone else. First you must know that you have already died. Now you must decide whether to die physically or start a new life. What new life? Serve me in everything I ask of you. What if I refuse? You will not suffer, and in 5 seconds you will be under the presence of Thani to decide your fate. I have no choice, replied the dwarf resignedly. Gosberg shook her hand, the dwarf suspiciously accepted it, and the Denka helped her up. Who are you? Ilaban. The dwarf froze. That couldn't be, the cursed god was a small Denka. But Gosberg was in a hurry. Agnoruk catches the dwarf. We must flood this mine so that no one knows what has happened here. You don't think people will suspect anything? The same thing is going to happen that caused the first defeat to the dwarfs in these mines. Too much coincidence. Gosberg smiled sarcastically at the half-orc as he touched the wall of the mine. I have been living with mortals for more than 5,000 years. Most of them don't even remember what they ate yesterday, as you expect them to remember what happened in these mines more than 50 years ago. Few are those who read books, they like to live in Inopia more. And of those who read, most of them don't read history, it's boring, they prefer more entertaining topics. So the few who will read as we have won today will be the scholars and historians, sitting in their libraries and offices. I know them well, and I assure you that scholars will think that they are legends invented by idiots, the Blue Devil, and other tales. Only 1 or 2 will connect the dots, but they will not pay any attention to them. Since there will be some great historian sitting the chair, and for that illustrious character it is most likely that what happened here will be unimportant. And others will accept what he thinks, since they appreciate his ego more than the truth. Agnoruk knew that Gosberg was right. Although victory inside the mine was key, in the end no one would care except the relatives of the dead. They ascended to the upper level. In the background the noise of dwarfs could be heard calling their companions. The threat had not completely disappeared. Tanya must have been one of those 2 or 3 who connected the dots, and she seemed to understand that the half-orc and the Denka were plotting. You can't flood the mine, we've diverted the riverbed to prevent it from happening again. Tanya commented with some pride. Gosberg smiled, as his eyes shone bright blue again. Tanya doesn't know the saying, you are more useless than a dwarf at chopping water. Gosberg stopped at the start of the 2nd level. Ever since he first descended into the mine, the half-orc had always been amazed by this area, since it had been designed by an imbecile. It was a very steep corridor and drew an angle of 90 degrees, which made it very difficult for the material to rise to the surface, something totally contrary to the rest of the mine. There Gosberg stayed right on the corner wall. He signaled for Agnoruk to step aside and climb the ladder that led to the 1st level. Gosberg smiled, knowing that the coup de grace was near. A blue light came out of his right hand with which he hit the wall of the mine. The blow resounded throughout the construction. Quickly the Denka climbed to Agnoruk and Tanya's height. The wall slowly began to break, more and more pressurized water came out of small cracks. Until the entire wall gave way, expelling a huge waterspout that began to advance towards the lower level. The flow of water was perfectly channeled through the corridor. Agnoruk nodded, so this was what it was for, he thought to himself. The force of the water would drag all the surviving corpses and dwarfs into the depths of the earth, consolidating the victory. Tanya was amazed. That was impossible, there was no undercurrent in that part of the mine. It's impossible, commented the dwarf. Agnoruk took her in his arms. Since the water level was beginning to rise, they had to reach the upper level as soon as possible. I got used to it, Agnoruk whispered to the dwarf. Gosberg began to advance towards the surface while speaking to the dwarf, who watched him in terror in the half-orc's arms. After the First Iron War, the great King Dasmir hired a group of dwarfs from the hills. They built a large water cistern inside the mountain and this structure to channel it in case of emergency. We knew that sooner or later you would try again, you dwarfs are too stubborn. Agnoruk smiled. It was impossible to beat the Denka. It was like when they played against him in card games, he always had trumps up his sleeve. He had decided to build the cistern more than 50 years ago so that he could use it today and thus win the battle for the time being. Outside, Kritus met Diana, who had called him, although the situation in the defense of the wall was delicate. It seemed that the attackers had given themselves a break. Diana told him that Agnoruk's orders were clear. When the sun set over the eastern mountains they must demolish the entrance to the mine. The dozen oxen were tied up and waiting for the order. The one who opposed it was Sebastian Darbical, the governor of the Red Mines. To do that was to lose the mine and the gems that were inside. A decision that King Dasmir II would never forgive him. But the truth was not in a position of power and could only protest and complain bitterly. It is the only source of income for the kingdom. If we demolish it, it will mean at least a year until it is operational again. We cannot afford it. Kritus Penisnegras did not have as his main virtues the ability to dialogue and patience. If Agnoruk and Gosberg fall, the enemy will attack us on two fronts and that is a certain defeat. It is impossible for them to have won, sir. There were hundreds of dwarfs. What Diana said was logical, but Kritus knew very well what the little Denka was capable of. He had seen it with his own eyes. The only thing that worried him was his delay in leaving. Kritus swallowed. It had been years since he had the feeling that all was lost. It had only happened to him a long time ago, more than half a century ago, in the Black Hills when they were defeated by the Stufos and he had to destroy the suspension bridge that linked his home to the surface to prevent those disgusting reptiles from slaughtering all his people. Diana, stir up the oxen now. The mercenary hesitated, but the screams on the wall warned of a new attack. That's an order. The mercenary raised her whip to strike the dozen oxen that were ready to knock down the two ashlar pillars of the mine when three figures came out of the mine walking. Rather two walking and another half dragged by the half-orc. It was Agnoruk next to Gosberg and the bundle they threw on the ground. It was a dwarf of the dorsal that had all its armor bloody. What has happened? Kritus asked. The attack on the mines was contained. Agnoruk replied fatigued. How? We have flooded the mines with water from the great mountain cistern. Gosberg replied with some pride. Sebastian Darbical put his hands to his head. That's worse than tearing down the mine entrance. The Denka patted the poor governor on the back. Hard work always has a reward. Tanya got up from the ground. She was not used to the brightness of the sun, especially without the protection of her helmet. The dislocated shoulder hurt tremendously, and he probably had some broken ribs. And this one? Asked the dwarf. She is the firstborn of the king of the dwarfs. Diana, please keep an eye on our guest, ordered the Denka. His face is deformed. Diana felt sorry. It is from birth, we have nothing to do with it, explained Agnoruk. They didn't have time to talk anymore, or rest. The eastern side of the wall was giving way. The dwarfs and Albionus soldiers began to scale the walls. The defenders were retreating, and only because Sabu was there brandishing his double-edged axe holding back the assailants, otherwise that flank would have fallen. Kritus protects the central door. The rest with me. And there they went. They forgot about Tanya. The truth. The dwarf lay down next to the oxen where a small shadow helped her view. Diana ignored the orders and joined the fight. It didn't matter. Tanya had no intention of escaping, and if she tried anything to help her fellow dwarfs, she would surely be dead the second. After what he had just seen inside the mine, it was certain defeat, though he suspected that with so many people watching, his two captors would not be as deadly as they were inside the mine. Indeed, they were not so lethal, but so little were cut much. It was Agnoruk and Gosberg, who had run out of daggers and now fought with a dwarven sword, to reach the eastern front and repel the attackers. Now in the daylight I could see them struggling more clearly. They had a hard-earned fame, accurate, precise attacks, which finished off the opponents in such a simple way that it even seemed like a game. Once the position was settled, Agnoruk went to the main gate where Kritis was barricaded. "For the moment we have contained them," announced the dwarf. "I think they know what happened in the mine, but they're going to attack again," Gosberg exclaimed as he jumped through the flames. Agnoruk spat. He was tired, he had been fighting for 5 hours and this did not seem to end. At the front were the dwarf troops and those of Olbiana. The defeat inside the mines instead of discouraging them had spurred them on. The catapults began to throw fireballs at the wooden wall. "We are not going to be able to contain this. There are too many," Kritis complained bitterly. "We have to maintain the position. Anyone who can carry a weapon who is ready to fight, Sebastian," Agnoruk ordered the governor of the mine. But the situation was untenable. The rain of balls was so intense that they had to abandon the wall that protected the main gate. The besiegers prepared for the final assault, advancing with the battering ram to finish breaking down the main gate. Agnoruk prepared his men in the courtyard. They would give war. They had to be repelled at the door where so many attackers could not pass. Suddenly in the sky a black crow landed on the door and began to peck until a piece of burnt wood fell off. It was a sign from his mother. "Prepare to open the gates and go out to attack." "What do you say? That's crazy," Kritis protested. Gosberg smiled as he climbed onto his son's shoulders. He had been provided with new daggers, which he adjusted to his belt. "Ha ha ha, well, finally something different," the Denka exclaimed. "Trust me, Kritis. Let's all go," Agnoruk shouted. Then, when the battering ram was positioning himself to knock down the door, it opened wide, leaving a flood of mercenaries and soldiers from Demember. The attackers did not expect this and were caught totally off guard. At first they backed down in the face of the improvised attack. But they were well-trained troops and knew that holding the position was crucial to survival. They managed to reorganize their lines and their numerical superiority made the defenders gradually have to give ground despite their good performance in the use of the sword and the number of casualties they caused. Victory was certain for the attackers at last, all the troops rushing towards the open door while Agnoruk barely held his position while cursing himself for having put his brilliant idea into practice. When all was lost, they came attacking from the rear the legendary wolf riders of the forest of Fambir, accompanied by the archers of Yapi, the spearmen of Alberon and other troops. It was the army of the Dragon Dorsal League that finally came to his aid. The dwarfs and Olbiana's soldiers were caught in a pincer like the one they wanted to make, but the good thing about having competent generals in command is that they know when a battle is lost. They were not nervous despite the numerous casualties. The dwarfs made their way as best they could looking for an escape route with their allies. Thanks to their shields they were able to make a corridor through which to escape from the death trap that was now the red mines for the Alliance. The defenders, seeing that with the unexpected help the attackers were retreating, did not go after them. They were exhausted since it had been a long siege and a desperate final battle. Agnoruk didn't want to fight anymore. It was actually a Pyrrhic victory, but a victory, after all.